Abnegation. The Second Incarnation of Death. After the enigmatic fall of the first incarnations to Hikaru at the Cataclysm, a mysterious period of about 500 years began where there were no incarnations due to a lack of successors in the Kirakatsu line. However, Hikaru's remaining son, the king of Andradis, would go on to have 4 children, as had his father, one to fill each incarnation position and the youngest to be the heir to the throne. This intricate web of succession, shrouded in the mists of time, is a testament to the enigma of incarnations. Now, the name of death has been lost to time, mainly because upon assuming the role, you are referred to by your title instead of your name, but I know it was his daughter, a gorgeous dark-haired beauty with striking green eyes and skin like bronze. She, along with her older brother and younger sister, would go on to be the next incarnations, and she, with her unique beauty and grace, would give us one of the worst horrors imaginable, the shade known only as the Nameless One. The mystery and intrigue of these incarnations, their unique characteristics, and their fates continue to captivate us. Initially, the transition to the new incarnations was perfectly acceptable. They did their jobs and ensured their responsibilities throughout Emphalis were taken care of. However, because these new incarnations had not been briefed by their previous counterparts or received any instruction or training, things soon got out of hand with them, but we will focus on the Incarnation of Death. He who would embrace death. About a millennia into her foray as Death, our dark-haired beauty grew lonely and wearisome of the constant solitude that came with her position. No one wanted to chat with Death, to entertain her, or be her friend. People shunned and avoided her everywhere, fearing that she had come to escort them into the void. Death, a figure of fear and isolation, hung in the shadows of alleys, weeping at her lot in life, stalking from town to town, from city to city, and country to country, ushering souls into the void, wishing inwardly that someday soon, her pain too would come to an end. The struggles of these incarnations, their profound isolation, and their burdens are a testament to the complexity of their roles. One day, while she was doing her daily lamenting, a young elvish man approached her, a fair-skinned elf of about 6 feet in stature with brown hair the color of oak and blue eyes the color of a clear lake. She sat in awe momentarily, her tears stemmed from the fluttering feeling that now pervaded her essence. Why does one as gorgeous as you grace an alley with your tears? Surely it would do you better to cry out to a god or goddess than it would to cry out to the nearest disease-ridden drunkard. And your pale white wings that seem to shine with an ethereal beauty would surely be better laid upon a temple altar than strewn about the street? What could have troubled one as you this much that you would forsake your magnificence to cover yourself in the dirt and grime of this place? The elvish man said when he reached her, stretching out his hand for her to take. It was warm and welcoming, much unlike the hands of the people she usually held, the hands of souls she brought into the void. You must be a fool or a drunkard yourself to go offering your hand to the Incarnation of Death. The elf fell to his knees here and bowed before her, his eyes turned down to the earth beneath him, his nose grazing the pavement of the alleyway. Death laughed at his reaction, amused at his split-second decision to worship her. Who was this elf, and why did he treat her this way? Upon hearing who she was, most people would have fled or cursed her and then fled. Yet this elf remained here, face bowed as if he had insulted some significant monarch or deity. Rise, elf, and explain yourself. Why do you not turn and flee me? Indeed, you know that it is within my power to take you away from life, and yet here you stand, unfazed by such a prospect. I can see that you are filled with respect and awe instead of reproach. Why should I fear death, a destiny all mortals must face? Is there a mortal who can withstand his destruction or a mortal who can keep living past his death? What need do I have to fear what is inevitable, whether now or later? Should I not embrace death as I have embraced life, as an old friend with whom I can experience things? No, death, you are no enemy of mine, no nightmare to be avoided. You are only a friend, a being to love and be loved. Tears were streaming from Death's eyes. She had never heard anything as beautiful in all her life. There was, somehow, a person who did not view her as something to be avoided, but something to be embraced and cherished. Moved by his words, Death stopped lamenting her life and began to follow the elf in her off time, unbeknownst to him. The angel and her lover. Death followed the elf closely over the next centuries, gathering as much information as she could from watching him. She saw as he grew from a young man into a mature elf, his brown hair now kept short and streaked with light grays on the side, his blue eyes now filled with the wisdom of his experiences. During this time, he had been traveling throughout the lands of Emphalis, studying the different animals and plants he came across, writing detailed journals complete with pictures he created using his energy as paint. Death became even more focused on him, a very knowledgeable man of impressive artistic talent, wanting him to study and draw her with the same attention to detail he offered these lowly things. It incensed her how much time he spent looking over plants and animals for any details he might have missed, seeming to caress them lovingly so as not to cause them too much distress as he examined them. Sometimes, it angered her so much that when he would leave an area for the next one, she would go behind him and drain the life out of the things he had touched and drawn, touched with the hands she wished only to be laid on her. One night, around 3 centuries after her stalking first began, she was overcome by the urge to see her lover up close and approached him in his camp, where he slept near the embers of the fire of the night before. The moonlight through the forest's trees cast shadows over his face, bathing him intermittently in light and dark. She approached him, pale wings wrapped around her like a gown, helping to shield her from the chill of the Zephyrian winter night. "Who's there?" asked the elf, startled awake by the unnerving aura put off by Death's approach. She had always remained at least 100 feet from him, keeping her aura as restrained as possible so as not to alert him to her presence or accidentally drain his life from him. This time, though, she had thrown caution aside, overcome by the urge to see him up close, talk to him, and possibly be held by him. She stepped in front of the dying embers of the fire and spread her wings wide, using her energy to cause the fire behind her to roar back to life with the intensity of star formation. The elf gave an exclamation of fear and scurried back from her, sheer terror etched across his face. "Do not flee me, my old friend," said Death softly and lovingly, stretching her hand out towards the elf, who recoiled from her like a viper. Hurt, Death took a step backward and turned around, covering her face with her hands, embarrassed at the predicament she now found herself in. Remembering seeing her in that alley those 3 centuries before, the elf outstretched his hand and patted her on the back, asking her quietly to calm herself. "Why did you flee me?" she wondered when she had finally calmed down, looking at him from across the fire she had restored in her flare. The elf thought momentarily and responded, "There's a parable told in the town where I grew up. When I was young, I saw Death and thought she was beautiful. Her existence was the very thing that made life precious. In my middle age, I fled from Death, fearful of an untimely end. Her existence was a plague on life, a curse to me, on all things alive and filled with beauty. And in my old age, I sought Death, but she evaded me, my life, her curse on me, my existence, her plague on the world. But in the end, she saw me, beautiful and dead, my corpse, the very thing which made life precious. It is the nature of living things, depending on their proximity to the grave, to react to death accordingly. As I am much closer to the void now than I was as a young man, I feel that my response to seeing you, rather than being a surprise, should have been expected." Death had no logical response to the elf's parable and his following thesis statement. She had been foolish at worst and love-blinded at best, letting her feelings rush her into things as if she were a young girl stricken with a fever curable only by the embrace of this man. As an incarnate, how could she find herself chasing after and stalking a mortal man, neglecting her duties to Emphalis any time it would take her too far from him? She realized here and now that her actions, much like those of her predecessor, were an egregious crime against Emphalis and against her role as an incarnation. Her purpose was not to love, but to shepherd those loved into the void, their place of peace and rest. Her uncle, the Death before her, had forsaken that path, that sacred duty, and gone off to war, aligning himself with one side rather than staying neutral and impartial as an incarnation should have. Was she now repeating the same mistake as her forebearer, as getting involved with the life of the one would make her no longer impartial to the lives of the many? Perhaps for the first time, she understood the dangers of the desire to have this elf, or maybe it was at this moment that she first decided that she would do as she saw fit, deciding that if he never had reason to fear her approach, he would never turn from her again. "I'm sorry to have disturbed your slumber," she said modestly, turning her back to him, her pale wings spread wide against the sparkling night sky. The elf sat in awe at her back, taking in the sight before him. Now that he was no longer afraid, he remembered how he had felt when he first saw her, the beauty she seemed to radiate even as she was downtrodden. She was a mythical creature, in essence, a being in numerous multitudes of power above him. He wished to study her, to understand her and her function the same way he had come to understand the various plants and animals he had previously studied. "Would you do me the honor of allowing me to paint your picture?" the elf asked cautiously, taking a careful step back if his words or intention had offended her. Death turned to face him, her green eyes appearing to peer through the elf and into his soul, causing a shiver to run down his spine. He steadied himself, cemented in the action he had taken. He had wanted to paint her, and if that want was to be what caused his downfall, it would be as destiny willed. He closed his eyes as death floated over to him, her black hair flowing in the slight breeze behind her, her pale wings spreading wide against the night's stars. A mortal man paint death? Such foolishness. And for what reason should you want to paint me, or I want a model for your painting? Am I not an incarnate whose job and duty supersede such trivial things? She tried her best to make herself sound how she felt she should answer, much to the horror of the elf, who sank to the ground in a pleading position, ready to accept the apparent outcome of his foolishness. "I study and paint plants and animals so that future generations might understand them better," the elf said into the ground, careful not to glance up at Death in case he should anger her anymore. "I thought only that Emphalis might benefit from having an understanding of one such as yourself, that Emphalis might learn more about your role and see you as more than just an incarnation. You hide your true intentions behind beautiful words and good meanings, but you do these things for you and your curiosity. You wish to paint me, not because it will somehow serve Emphalis, but because you believe it will help you understand more about yourself and the world around you." The elf grimaced at these words and looked up at Death. He was unsure how, but she somehow knew what he felt and sought in his life. "And if that should be the case?" he asked, unsure if these would be his last spoken words. "You shall have your painting," Death said, rising slowly into the air. 3 decades from now, on the southern coast of Andradis, a man will take his own life by hanging himself from the alaline tree embedded in the cliffside. If you should truly desire to create this painting, meet me there at sunset. Is it okay for me to know that sort of information?" the elf asked, concerned. He was not sure, if any, the implications could be if he knew of a person's death beforehand. "I'm not entirely sure what, if anything, you could do with the information. Even if you tried to prevent him from killing himself, there's nothing you could do to stop me from collecting his soul as scheduled. And what if I should die before the 30 years? I'm not sure you can. The best way I can explain it is that if someone of the importance of an incarnation says you will meet me somewhere, it becomes woven into your destiny. Or maybe it always was your destiny. Either way, I am sure there is no reason for concern, and if you desire to understand me, you will be at that alaline tree at sunset." Then she vanished in a flash of pale green light. The Nameless One. Over the next 3 decades, the elf wandered around northern Zephyr and southern Andradis, studying and painting every new plant and animal he encountered. He had even taken to painting the scenery and drawing maps of the places and countries he had visited, creating the first comprehensive map of Emphalis. Death had gone about her duties more diligently since their late-night conversation, no longer feeling the need to stalk him as she knew he would come to her at the aforementioned time. But that time came sooner than she had expected, sooner than it should have for an elf so kind. As the elf lay dying, his breath shallow and his body broken, the Incarnation of Death stood beside him. Her pale wings shimmered faintly in the twilight, casting a soft glow over his fading form. His once bright blue eyes, now dim and clouded, searched for hers with a flicker of recognition, but there was no fear in them, only a weary acceptance of the end. You've come, he whispered, his voice thin and fragile. Death knelt beside him, her dark hair falling over her shoulders, her green eyes filled with sorrow. Her hand hovered over his chest, trembling slightly as if struggling with the weight of what she was about to do. I always come, she murmured. For everyone. But you're not like the others. The elf coughed, his body shuddering from the pain, his strength almost gone. And what makes me so different? He rasped, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Even now, I am just another mortal, ready to die. Her eyes shimmered with something more profound, something she had never dared express in all the years she had followed him. You're different to me, she whispered, barely audible. I have watched you for centuries. And I cannot bear to lose you. The elf smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion and disbelief. What are you saying? I love you, Death admitted, her voice breaking as the words slipped from her lips. It was her first time speaking them aloud, and their weight was unbearable. I have loved you since you first approached me, unafraid, when all others fled. You were the only one who did not fear me, the only one who saw something more. And I cannot let you go. The elf's eyes widened in shock. His body was failing, but the weight of her words was like a jolt through him. You love me? He breathed, his voice trembling with disbelief. She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. Yes, and because of that, I cannot take you into the void as I should. Instead, I offer you something different. Something that will let you stay. Her hand pressed against his chest, and a dark, pulsating energy flowed from her into him. It was not the peace of death, but something twisted, something that clung to the edges of life. The elf gasped, his body convulsing as the energy filled him, reshaping him in ways no mortal body should endure. His skin paled, his once bright eyes darkened into hollow voids, and his heartbeat slowed to a faint echo before stopping entirely. I offer you unlife, she said, her voice trembling. A way to remain in this world. The laws of mortality will not bind you, but you will not be alive as you once were. You will live in the shadows, feeding on the souls of the living. Any mortal you touch will have its essence drained and added to yours. If that should drain them entirely, they will become a husk in your service, seeking and draining more lives and souls for you, my undead emperor, because it is the only way you will survive. The elf's body shook violently as the transformation took hold. His form became twisted and cold, his spirit tethered to the world by the dark magic death had given him. He looked down at his hands, now pale and unnatural, and horror washed over his face as the weight of what had happened sank in. What have you done to me? He whispered, his voice filled with pain and disbelief. You cursed me. Death's expression crumpled, her wings trembling. No, I saved you, she whispered. I did this because I could not bear to lose you. You call this saving? He spat, his voice rising angrily. You've turned me into a monster. A soulless creature that must steal life to exist. I would rather have died than live like this. His blackened eyes burned with rage and betrayal. Death recoiled as if struck, her heart breaking at his words. I did it out of love. I couldn't let you go, she pleaded, her voice barely holding together. You thought wrong, he shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally. You damned me to this existence for your selfish love. You never asked me what I wanted. You did this for yourself, not for me. Tears spilled down Death's cheeks as she looked at him, devastated by his rejection. I thought I was saving you, she whispered, her voice breaking. You didn't save me, he said, his voice cold and bitter. You took everything from me. You took my peace, my life, and twisted it for your desires. I curse you, Death. I curse you for your love. He turned from her, his form fading into the darkness, his soul bound forever to the hunger that now consumed him. The shadow of the elf he once was disappeared into the night, leaving Death behind, shattered and alone. She stood in the twilight, her wings wrapped around her like a shroud, the weight of her unrequited love and his curse sinking deep into her soul. She had given him the only gift she knew, the only way she could keep him, but in doing so, she had lost him forever. And so, knowing he would never give up his hate of her, Death passed on from this world, leaving her role to its third holder, who holds the title in the present. As the shade came to be called, the Nameless One fled north, past Endradus into the permafrost, waiting for the one who could remove Death's curse.